PrEPositions, lodged in the back of my throat, held as tightly as the slack of a man's Johnny-come-lately soul I sup, to the quick, make thicken and dissolve into the symphony of myselves, sieved and open, I implore you. O friend, I refuse to take inside for years. Oh, to see your wonders performed, how trill the sound of my perfidious blood honeydewed. Look at us and marvel at whose we become. Big pharma's sugar mamas, hankering for daddy's diamond DNA's unfiltered. I'm always dropping you in sentences these days with a question mark, as I whisper to you with the same breathless assurance I want to give my every corpuscle to the ones who choose tenderness when most herald savage, woke, petty as fuck, on the online market to the highest bidder. It took years before I realized I'd forgotten to let you in, forgotten to say within tandem, in a last will, in a love letter I left to the flesh of my flesh, not yet birthed into this nation in which I call our clan's father lit and beautiful. For he is, so much so I would cuss God and dye my soul blacker if I could. If I could, I'd sing myself happy, kissing every crater of our father's pale face, kiss his woman's lips too. For this slave wrote us a love letter once, when she spied a glimpse of our bicontinental future body bagged. Who can sing thy force, she extolled, with palms outstretched. Imagine that. Oh, bittersweet pill we take and feast upon where'er we go, so that no one sees the secrets we carry in our pockets now. Squares that we are, we've swallowed hope and shat fear of the truth we know. We are so good to gather. We do the police in different voices too. Our selfhoods and hoodies, our woadies wilding upon the dancing mashinas of our woulda, coulda, shouldas, our shekinahs to a glory made whole by you. We are so pregnant, thanks to you, with possibilities. Let us swallow our soul's salvation, commence with this born again earth's new covenant. Prep, are ye the way of the Lord? I wrote this poem in the wake of completing my first book, Sacrilegion, which was invested in exploring and getting outside of my mind onto a page what it felt like growing up in a body and a mind and a spirit that was just so much bigger than all the labels put upon it, whether it was disabled in a way that was visible because of the paralysis of my left hand. I live with a condition called Erb's palsy, and so I don't use my left hand. I was breached at birth, and during a forceps birth, nerve damage occurred to my brachial plexus nerve specifically and other things. But I've just found out recently that during birth, there was probably some cognitive damage done. And so that there were invisible differences in the way my mind works that could be labeled disabilities, but had never been until recently when I suffered a head injury and have been going to neuropsychologists. So for me, when I think of disability poetics, and I think of what I was trying to write, both in this poem and my larger oeuvre of discovery, which is what poetry is for me, I'm trying to write into and through the physical realities that I see and experience, the multivalent ways in which I walk in this physical frame with all of its gifts and limitations. But I'm also trying to get at the existential, the spiritual, the metaphysical vastness of my existence that the world may not be able to see because of how they see my racial and ethnic markers, how they read what is for them, a cisgender presentation when that is, limited, that limits a two-spirit reality that I live with. I'm not transgender. I am two-spirit, but I spiritually, I own and feel the feminine in a way that I don't feel the need to present externally in the way some of my trans sisters and brothers do. But I own the feminine within me because we all start there. 7 weeks, we are feminine. We start with the estrogen, the testosterone and other things come, later. The testes and all those other things come later. And some of us, I think, carry into our outside of our mother's wombs an understanding of an intimacy with the feminine that is pathologized in the world, in a patriarchal world that clearly feels that women need to be dominated and controlled. And so to me, that presents a kind of quote unquote disability in the way that I walk through the world, because I don't represent masculinity in the way that the world can read as the way it should be presented. I don't see that as a disability, but I think that's mapped onto me. I also have neurodivergences, with anxiety and depression and other things that are outgrowths of being discriminated against because of my physical disability, because of the way that I walk through gender in a non-binary, spiritually multiple way. My pronouns are he and we. And so it's always a complex question for me to answer when one asks me to define disability poetics, because I think that we think of it as something physical. And now we're starting to think about cognitive. Maybe in the last several years, particularly when you're thinking about people who are raced as Black and brown and non-white, although whiteness is a race like every other race that is created. We are just being allowed into a conversation about mental health because in order to, quote unquote, integrate into spaces that we were not welcome in, we had to sort of sublimate the things that made us not, as quote unquote acceptable or to the mainstream. Although I grew up in all Black spaces. I grew up out here in a rural space where Black people have been autonomous since emancipation, not wanting or needing to be included into white spaces. Now, I went to an HBCU where the predominant number of people who were there were excellent presidential scholars, valedictorians like myself, who were highly intelligent, but we did not have to think about what are our white classmates or teachers going to say? Are they going to challenge us? Are they going to? So I've always thrived in these spaces where I'm outside of, and that too can be seen as something that is disabling in a world that wants everybody to be white and male, in order to be accepted, and rich, because we have to think about class too. And so this poem specifically was an experiment. I thought, what would it look like if I wrote a poem made almost entirely of prepositional phrases? One of the things that has haunted me my entire life is the scourge of HIV and AIDS. I learned of it as a very young boy when I lost 2 cousins to it when I was about 6 or 7 years old. They were 2 of my closest cousins, one of whom was a bodybuilder before this happened to him and was, in the world as this very hyper-masculine straight man who privately struggled with drug addiction and maybe his sexuality. And then his older sister died right after him, who was also someone who struggled with drug addiction. And then I had people in my community who would die in silence. I was a journalist for 20 years, and my very first story that I wrote was about a man from my hometown here in Marianna, Florida, who was living and dying in Tallahassee, Florida, where I studied at Florida A&M with HIV. And my first story was written about World AIDS Day, which the anniversary is coming up. World AIDS Day is December 1st every year. And so HIV has been the specter over my head, was the worst thing I thought that could ever happen to me. And when it came into my, intimate life with partners and in my own walk with being a person who loves people who present and identify as male, same gender loving, and predominantly Black, I had to wrestle with that. I had to wrestle with losing not just cousins, but loved ones, partners, friends. And that's what Sacrilegion was obsessed with. You know, the deaths of is dedicated to, if you look in the back of the book, to all these friends that I lost in the early 2000s as the arrival of all these antiretrovirals were supposed to extend life. But a lot of people who were dealing with these comorbidities of, you know, mental health challenges and not always having access to medicines and healthcare, I lost a lot of loved ones in the 2000s. So Sacrilegion was born out of that. In the wake of that, this medicine that could be preventative to prevent HIV emerged called PrEP. And so I was looking at PrEP as an idea of what does it mean to be able to have a new world, to have these intimacies without fear of death, or to be at least forestalled by this pill that's supposed to save the day and save the world. And so PrEP came, of course, with the way my brain works. PrEP is the beginning of, you know, the opening syllable of prepositions. And so I decided to write a series of prepositions that was an extension of the prayers and songs that were in Sacrilegion. And so this was a transitional poem out of Sacrilegion into the manuscript that I'm writing right now, that historicizes further back into the Reconstruction era. What does it mean to have a free, autonomous Black space, starting with one's body, one's corporeal freedom, and extending into a community that is in the absence of, in absence of fear of white supremacy? Because in this very space that I am right now, where my ancestors were once enslaved, we now own this land. And we have owned it since the 1870s. And I grew up not being taught to be afraid of or hate white people or resent them. I had no desire to be white. I was not told that in order to be accepted into the world, I had to assimilate into kind of a white understanding of what the world is. I grew up as an autonomous, loved Black child who was taught to love myself just as I am, including with all the different ways that I am, quote unquote, disabled. In fact, it wasn't until I came to FSU that I even used the label disabled. And it was because of my friend and colleague, the cyborg, Jillian Visa, who said, we need you to share this part of yourself with the world. You've been writing about it, but you haven't owned it. I always used differently abled, or I always kind of gave a positive spin to the different gifts and ways that I am different. But I understand now, out of the need for community that I did not necessarily have with this aspect of my walk, to say, yes, I too have neurodivergence. Yes, I too am, you know, disabled. Brother, sister, friend, let us come together and build community.